us Mike O'Brien, former mayor of the city of Winooski, and we have with us Bill Niquette, who's the former director of the Winooski Community Development Corporation. It's an acronym we haven't used in a little while, so it doesn't roll off my tongue anymore. So again, welcome. Unfortunately, we don't have Clem Bisonette with us. He fell ill and couldn't.
He's here in spirit.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah. So we have Clem's smiling face shining down on us here. So we also have with us Carolyn Gould, who's the president of the Chittenden County Historical Society. She has the Chittenden County Historical Society is co-sponsoring this event. So they have an event that Carolyn would like to speak about momentarily.
Carolyn. Our director is in charge. So.
Yes.
Absolutely.
They're good to join us here.
So I just want all of you to mark your calendars for July 11th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at City Hall in downtown Burlington, City Hall Park. We are going to join, like we did last year for the 60th anniversary, with Ethan Allen Homestead and the City of Burlington to do a Vermont showcase, which will be a showcase of not-for-profits dealing with history and culture and lifestyle, some UVM people, and it's going to be a great event. And the fact that it's going to be sort of part of Burlington's 250th celebration. So mark it on your calendars. It'll be fun. July 11th, 10 to 2, and if any of your organizations are interested, you can contact me at cgould, cchpresident, @gmail.com, or Joe, or any of us probably around here involved in history organizations and other cultural events. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and to have the support of a city is really great, so thank you.
And just a little pitch here. Anyone who's interested in future Winooski Historical Society events, we do have a Facebook page. If you're on social media, we post a lot of our events there. If you want further notifications or want to know what's happening, I serve as president. My name's Joe Perrin. Shoot me a note. We're happy to keep you in the loop. And we'll have Mike take it away here. Thank you, Mike.
And thanks for coming, everyone. It's good to see you. Billy Niquette, as Joe said, is the former executive director of the Winooski Community Development Corporation, which was really the lead in the downtown redevelopment. And if it wasn't for his dogged determination, it wouldn't have happened. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, me and a few others, but
Yeah. But anyway, so we're going to say a few things. We'd love to answer any questions you might have. We've got a bunch of pictures and stuff up here of some of the early, well, actually, we got a picture of what it was like, downtown was like before the redevelopment, and then a bunch of pictures of during development, and these are some of the early plans that were drawn up for the development. But I'm going to start with a little video that I picked up from CCTV. I think it's about maybe 10 minutes. It's called Winooski City of Rebirth or Redevelopment or Reincarnation or something. I forget what it is. Anyway, it's something like that. Anyway, I'll play that because it talks about, talks with Clem and Bill and me and some of the people on the city council at the time. I think you were too shy, Sally. Yeah. Sally Tipson's here, who was on the city council during this whole thing, and another important person in the redevelopment. So let me play that, and then we'll start talking a little bit about the background, how the whole thing came to be, the early designs, and where we are now.
Pay the taxes.
two critical things had happened. One, VSAC had announced that they were leaving town to move to potentially Colchester because they needed to expand and didn't have a place to do that in Winooski. And second, within a month of that, the grocery store and hardware store complex that had been a part of the fabric of the city for a long time announced that the grocery store was leaving and that the property was for sale. And so there was a great deal of turbulence within the Winooski community, potentially losing its largest employer and the only store that was really meaningful to people down there.
But the city needed to do something from not just a tax-based perspective, but I think it had something to do with, maybe the heart of Winooski.
The way it was heading the wrong way down the river. At some point, we would have just drowned. We'd have been overtaken by the current.
In the spring of 1999, Mayor Clem, Bisonette, and Winooski Community Development Corporation Executive Director Bill Niquette announced a new vision for Winooski's downtown. The question on many minds was, how would this plan succeed when others had failed?
I think the timing was just right. I think we had a very dynamic council, which took the bull by the horns, for lack of a better term, and just said, let's go. We had Bill Niquette, who said, I would really like to see this project get underway. He was very active in making that happen.
When we started this planning in 1999, we had a lot of public hearings. As we progressed with the plans, we had special meetings or we had updates at the council meeting. And we heard from citizens, and there were two messages that we got. We want access to the river, and whatever you do with the mill, we want to see public access.
Finally, the time seemed right for a downtown revitalization. The city had leadership, community support, and the opportunity to assemble crucial pieces of property.
A key aspect of the project from the beginning was the idea that we were not large enough as a community development corporation to be a developer who would actually build everything within the project. Our goal was to assemble the land, to create the necessary permit structure to make the site attractive for private developers.
When you go back to '98 and you go to the very start of this project, the concept was to build flexibility into the plan. And how they did that was through the Act 250 permit process with the state of Vermont.
The concept was to build this thing out in really urban blocks that resembled the original development pattern. So the first phase of the project was really focused on what used to be the area between Main Street and Barlow Street.
Phase 1 of the project called for road and utility improvements, a new building for the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, and a parking garage. It also included student apartments to be built around the garage. Additional phases called for a mix of affordable and market-rate rental housing, luxury condos, and a boardwalk along the Winooski River. By 2001, the master plan had Act 250 approval.
The major issue was, how were we going to make the finances work?
Well, Bill Niquette came to us in early 1999 with the project pretty much as we see it today. He understood that he was going to need some public money, particularly community development block grant money that flows through HUD through the state of Vermont. And he also realized that to get it in small bites, he was not going to realize the economy of scale that he needed to do a project of this size. Well, first there was a learning curve to go through because the state of Vermont had never used its Section 108 authority before.
In 2002, the project reached a critical juncture. The financing hinged on the HUD loan, which required a guarantee from the state. The city had been working with the Dean administration to secure the approval when Governor Dean decided not to seek re-election. The new governor was supportive of the project, but his staff wanted a fresh look before signing off.
Governor Douglas at first wasn't going to support the program. He called us to Montpelier and he said, I cannot support this the way it's being designed.
And it wasn't until the governor and primarily Commerce and Community Development from the state that finally made the point that they needed to have a significant private investor.
We came back, we sat around the table, we sat with Jim Pizzagalli, who was our master developer, Pizzagalli Realty. They went out and found Hall Keen to come in to fill that need.
When I understood the scope and the scale and the quality of the project, it was something that we were definitely interested in. Well, I think it was a combination of the physical attractiveness of the site and the opportunity of rebuilding the downtown around the Champlain Mill. Infill development in a historic neighborhood, a historic district, is something that was really attractive to myself and to our partners.
So today I'm here to announce that I believe that the Winooski Falls Riverfront Redevelopment Project can work. And we expect to
With
be able
Hall
to
keen on
provide
board to build housing on the site, the project finally received state approval and the HUD loan. It was time to move forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Winooski Falls Riverfront Downtown Project groundbreaking. We're happy you could all make it with us today.
There we go, forward. I should have cut it off before that young buck.
Right, exactly.
Anyway.
There's a theme here. 25 years removes a lot of hair. That's what I take away from, yeah.
What are you going to do, right?
They said it for presidential administration.
So as you saw there early on, well, let me go back to the beginning. So I know we had conversations about, if you look at what was there before, we call it the hole in downtown. What are we going to do? And Billy was like, well, let's see what we can do. And he hired Bill Truex, right, an architect, to, was it Anderson, or was it, Bill Truex was the first one you?
Yep, yeah. That's right. That's right.
Don't be shy, don't be shy.
I'm not shy, I'm just fine. Yeah.
Anyway, he drew a plan. This is what you can do. And Howard Dean was on board, but Howard Dean said, I like it, but you need at least 1,000 units of housing down there. And we're like, really? Okay, whatever. And then he left, and Jim Douglas came in, and Jim Douglas said, who's going to do this? And we're looking at each other going, well, we are. With what? We don't know. So he said, you got to get someone with deep pockets to do the downtown. So that's when Hall Keen came in. You also saw Mike McNamara from HUD. We secured a $23.8 million loan, 108 loan from HUD. And they were pretty impressed with us because we paid it off in a year, right? We refinanced it in a year. And I think, if I remember right, that had never been done. Is that right?
But in that way, right?
In that way.
That's right.
Yeah. So we're sitting here with basically a $25 million loan, scratching our head going, how are we going to do this? And I think you did you come up with the idea of the TIF?
Well, so, yeah, I mean, there's a few. So the idea behind this loan, not to bore everyone to death with details, but it's in the news these days, this tax increment financing again, because the legislature spent a lot of time on a pilot project that they've put in last year. And so it's worth thinking about this for a minute. So tax increment financing allows cities in different places to take tax revenue from new development that's going to be coming in that wouldn't happen if you didn't make an investment in the infrastructure, and to pledge that money towards paying off a bond. So in the middle of what Mike's compressed 6 years of my life into 45 seconds, so my head's reeling a little bit. But early on in the process, we identified a number of different federal funding sources, especially money from the Department of Transportation, that were available to help to rebuild the city. One of the big focuses from all those public hearings that you saw was that the earlier improvements that were made by the Department of Transportation in the 1970s and 80s really turned Winooski into a racetrack, right? I grew up here in the 1970s and in the early 1980s is when I was, growing up, and I wasn't allowed to go downtown, right? The idea was people drove 70 miles an hour through town around the corner there, and it wasn't a safe place for kids to go, and if you went there, you would find a downtown that had, between the mill and the shopping center that had been built, the entire river had been blocked off anyway. So if you went down to what is now the Riverwalk, you would see a number of shopping carts sticking out of the ground, and it was a dumping area behind the loading dock of the hardware store and the grocery store, and it was privately owned, so you weren't really supposed to be there anyway, And so the idea was, how do we try to take some new investment from the Department of Transportation and others and reestablish a more pedestrian-oriented downtown? But no matter how much federal state funding you bring into these things, you always need what's called a local match. The city has to be part of that investment. Whether the feds pay 80% or 90% or 50%, the city still needs to make a contribution. And so this HUD loan was effectively, I mean, not surprisingly, even back then the city didn't have millions of dollars in reserve to invest in its future. So this loan was intended to basically be the glue that would be the local funds that would be leveraged by all these other grants. So we spent 4 years while we were doing all these pretty pictures identifying a financing mechanism, but at the end of the day, there were these $20 million worth of expenses, principally the construction of the parking garage that now is between Main Street and Barlow Street, that weren't eligible for federal money. And so the city needed to have a tool to do that. And that tax increment financing, while the tool was available, the voters in the city said, yes, you can use the new tax revenues for this. You can't pledge the general obligation of the city toward it. It has to be limited to these tax revenues. And so the question becomes, in some way, you've now got authority from the voters to go do something, but you don't have someone willing to make the loan. And this Section 108 loan that Mike was referring to is a program of the federal government where the state or a city can pledge some of its future grants as a backstop, as collateral for a loan, if the local jurisdiction has reasonable way to pay it back. So it's sort of somebody to stand behind you. Imagine that you're co-signing a car loan for your child, right? You're hoping you never have to actually step in and make that payment, but in fact, the loan is being made to someone else, but you're saying if it doesn't get paid for one reason or another, we will use these future grants to pay it off. And it took us, for better or for, it was an interesting idea. It was something that had never been done in Vermont in that way. And so it took us 3 years, a year and a half with Governor Dean, and then literally only a few weeks before we thought we were going to move forward, this change of government happened. We had imagined at the time that the then Lieutenant Governor would be elected governor. When that didn't happen, and we had that support, when that didn't happen, we had to effectively start over and go back to the state from scratch and say, what do we need to do to prove to you this is a good idea? And that's effectively how that fit.
So again, if you have any questions while we're going through this, feel free to raise your hand and ask. Yeah, okay?
For sure.
Hopefully this stuff is understandable. But anyway, so I put a picture up of the old Main Street before the redevelopment. And one of the things we talked about early on was how to make it more pedestrian friendly. And at the time, there were actually 5 lanes of traffic going up and down. And it was like, I remember being downtown and seeing some gentleman trying to cross the street down at the corner of West Canal Street. He got halfway across and there was a pedestrian signal said go back or whatever, and they froze. They didn't know what to do. And there's cars zooming by both ways. So it's like, okay, we got to do something. And the idea of the traffic circle came into play. Now, I know some people hate the traffic circle. Some people like the traffic circle. I think it's done, it moves traffic more effectively than what we had before, because there were traffic lights at West Canal Street, at West Allen Street, at Barlow Street, and you could be stuck there for 5 or 10 minutes trying to get from East Allen Street into Burlington. So love it or hate it, that's what we have, and I think it moves traffic anyway. So that was the idea there on the traffic circle. I think these are some of the early renditions.
Sure,
Yep.
yeah.
These are some of the first renditions we had for redeveloping the downtown, and I'll let Billy talk through it because he knows these like the back of his hand.
Yeah, I had to laugh because you wouldn't have noticed, but that younger version of me with all the hair was pointing at some of these actual drawings, which I pulled out of my attic. Like this is one of this particular drawing which is a good place to start actually, was in my car for 5 years, and my wife would get so fed up because there was no one or no excuse was left unturned to pull. And let me tell you about this great drawing I have. So now I feel 30 years younger standing here doing it again. You'll have to come up and see these things later so you get a sense of it. But I always started with this picture from the 1960s before urban renewal cleared the blocks east of Main Street, because so much of our story was about trying to return downtown Winooski to a sense of scale that it had before. Many times in Vermont we're thinking about paving a green field to put some new development in place, but here this is an area that in the 1960s was fully built out as 4 blocks of, really 5 blocks of dense urban development, right? Not necessarily a development that a lot of people thought was in good shape, but it was there. It was walkable housing for people who once worked in the mills. People used to call this area east of Barlow the old Fort Pick. But it was a combination of walk-up tenements and residential buildings, and there were streets there. I was born in '73 and grew up on North Street. My experience of downtown Winooski was very different, right? It was a Winooski that had, post-urban renewal. Here's that exact same 5 blocks of space. It had been cleared. Right? I mean, in fact, this entire, was all 5 blocks of that development was torn down as, urban renewal, right, in '72 and '73. And this was done back in the days when HUD funded projects under the if you build it, they will come theory. It's what caused a very large swath of downtown Burlington to get torn down in the late 1960s. The experience there wasn't that much different than here. From 1972 when it was torn down until 1981 when the shopping center was built, this was a field. There were things in the Free Press published about the world's most expensive cow pasture and things of that nature. This was just an unused piece of land, and all of the cartoons that had been drawn at that time for filling it in didn't come to pass. But it meant that years later, when we had the chance to buy this shopping center out of bankruptcy, when the time period of the video was coming around, the late 1990s, we had not only an opportunity to put this land back together, but also 30 years worth of drawings of things people had already previously come up with there. And so oftentimes people ask, why did we get it done? When so many other versions of it had not happened. And the simple reality in my mind, although I appreciate Mike's desire to talk about tenacity of me and a few other people, is I was able to come to this with 2 really important elements resolved. One is most of this land was already assembled, right? We're not talking about buying old buildings and having to tear them down or renovate them. It was an empty space that nobody really particularly liked anymore. By the time I became involved, these shopping centers had gone into bankruptcy and they were no longer being used. So we didn't have to fight against somebody who didn't want to be there, right?
So let's pick up on that a minute, because the land that was assembled.
Yep.
Basically, the Champlain Mill, Ray Pecor, owned all of this except for a spot here where there was a branch bank. And do we have, right here, we'll go to this picture. So you can come up afterwards and see. So Ray owned the parking lots and the Champlain Mill. The bank was its own piece. The shopping center was the land over here. There was was it Gadgew's dry cleaner with a former gas station on this corner here. And then Green Mountain Power owned 100 acres, 110 acres to the east. That was,
including all the riverfront.
Yeah, all the riverfront, and basically it is now what it was then, except they had a bunch of power lines and stuff like that. So there was really 5 pieces of property that had to be assembled for us to control 120 some odd acres of land that we could, that we could develop. So, and I will say, I think it was Citizens Bank was the bank, and they said, yeah, we'll sell it to you. Ray Pecor said, yeah, we'll sell you all the land except for the land under the mill. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Green Mountain Power said, yeah, we'll sell you that land. The hardest one was Gadju's, who didn't want to sell, but they did in the end, right? So, yeah.
Who was the developer who originally put in the strip mall?
Why are you asking me these hard questions, Joe?
Because I'm just curious, like, because Tony Pomerleau was, famous for that throughout the state. Why he never took that on?
Yeah, I don't know, but as Bill said, this sold it was in bankruptcy, and it sold with, I think, 9 other multi-tenant retail properties across the country. And I think you called them up and said, will you sell?
Yeah. I mean, really, when you think about how this really started, I came back to Vermont after graduating college in '94, and at that time met Art Hogan, who was then the chair of the Regional Planning Commission. And he was really taking me under his wing to inform me. I grew up in Winooski, but I honestly didn't know the whole history of urban renewal and all the things that happened with it. I knew the Winooski I grew up in. I didn't really appreciate all of that. And Art brought me into the fold. He was actually the director of urban renewal in Burlington. And sort of brought me into to understand how all of this came to be. And when the shopping center went into bankruptcy, I was actually on the board of directors of the WCDC as a volunteer. And Art came to me one night and said, you may not realize it, but this is the biggest opportunity you could have if you could find some way to buy this shopping center or find a friendly party to work with, then you would have the opportunity to put something back together and really view this as something other than just a shopping center. I mean, again, remember when this was all torn down in the 70s, the dream was not to have a shopping center there, right? The dream was this beautiful urban space that, I mean, to some degree, the street grid that we have today. But after 7 years of it sitting as a field, when this out-of-state firm, whose name is escaping me, I'll get it for you, wanted to build that shopping center, it was sort of something is better than nothing by that point,
And then, of course, the dome idea came to be.
Right.
We won't
go into the dome, right?
Well, I was just kind of curious because I remember in that same time frame that you're describing, it was a pretty lively shopping center.
Right.
There was a hardware store, there was a Chinese restaurant, there was the dry clean, there was a bunch of stuff in there to dead very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it always feels that way, right? So, I mean, what happened with that area in the 80s was Ray put all that money, Ray Pecor put all that money in the Champlain Mill. The exchange rate from Canada was spectacular. My experience being 12, 13 years old, walking down to the Champlain Mill was to go through Carol Reed and all of the old, all of these ski shops selling $500 coats in 1981. It was a beautiful space, but it wasn't a space that in any way really related to everyday Winooski outside of the restaurants that I think, were kind of loved by locals to come down and visit, right, where Waterworks is now and the Prime Factor on the other side. And there was that period of time in the 80s that was kind of a heyday. You had the mill was really rolling, and those shopping centers were really, pumping out. But by the time the early 90s rolled around and the Shaw's and Costco development happened up at Exit 16, honestly, Winooski voted with their feet, and most people started shopping at the larger, prettier, newer spaces, and the grocery store started to turn downward, and it did happen pretty quickly from there.
I remember that there was a lot of people who were illegally dumping stuff behind the grocery store, and it was pretty gnarly back there.
Yeah.
On the Riverwalk.
Yeah. Judy.
So who owned the building where the supermarket was, the grocery store, and the land under that?
That's what we're trying to remember who it was.
By the time we tried to buy it, which, so between 1996 and 1998, when we were first starting to think about this while I was on the board, when it went into receivership, When the bank gave up the property, the bank that had the loan on the property took it back. They assemble these things into large packages and sell them together. So there was a firm out of Illinois that I effectively had to go make an offer to. So here I am, 25 years old, never bought anything in my life, bigger than a car. Rolling into Ray Pecor's office, Art Hogan pushing me on the back, saying, "Go talk to Ray, he'll help you," and saying, "Hey Ray, look, we want to buy this shopping center and we want you to guarantee the loan." And when he got done laughing the first time, he said, "Well, why?" We sort of said, "Look, as goes this property, so goes your property," and we believe we're the right local group of people who can build some consensus around what to do with it. And if this works the way I want it to work, you won't ever have to buy it, but you will actually be able to, precipitate being a big part of getting this done. And to his credit, the WCDC had very limited financial resources. If Ray hadn't stepped up and effectively stood behind us to go and get that initial loan to make the offer, we would not have been credible to secure that property, and none of it would have happened. So in my mind, financially, Ray never actually had to write a check, but he put a tremendous amount of faith in the city and frankly in me, which I've always been very grateful for.
Question back there. Oh, I'm sorry, Judy, another follow-up?
So the initial loan to buy the property with the city got, was that $23 million, or was that something else?
No, so when we start, so look, the idea was shopping center goes vacant, property becomes available. The most likely outcome from that discussion was that a dollar store or some kind of a really low-end, retail buyer would have bought it. That's the normal buyer for a property like that. They would come in, put no money in it, put a super cheap tenant in there that would just run the place into the ground. That's sort of the normal cycle of how these shopping centers would work. So back then, all we were trying to do was raise what turned out to be about $1 million to buy the shopping center. And so, we were hoping to get it for less than that, but at the end of the day, in order to get them to break it out from their package and sell it, they effectively wanted that was the number that we ended up arriving at. And Ray secured a loan that we got from the Howard Bank then, the WCDC, with Ray's support, to buy the shopping center. And we negotiated with Ray to, under certain circumstances, be able to buy his property without having to pay for it until we had everything assembled. And at that point, that's when we approached the city to say, look, we can't actually close on this and buy it unless there's buy-in with the city that you want to pursue these grants and other things to improve it. We weren't in a position to own a shopping center, right? We were buying it in order to create this assemblage and make it something that a private developer would want to come and put money into. Why is someone going to come here instead of coming to Burlington or some other larger place? It's because we would make it easier for them to do it by solving these land problems and permit problems that normally make Vermont difficult to develop in.
Got a question back there first.
So I know this is about the time when Higher Ground begins its legacy in Vermont.
Yeah.
Can you kind of tie that into this?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we were talking about this before. So Higher Ground was Higher Ground when they. Yeah, he can. Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Look at this, we're like all coordinated.
I think we practiced.
So, right, exactly. So here's the mill. This is the building where the grocery store was, and this is the building that originally housed the Denny's of all places. Higher Ground's first go-around was the Denny's. What's that? I think it was actually Denny's first, right? And then it became the disco, like all of the stuff, they ripped the Denny's out. And then there was a place, it was called Whispers for a while, and then the Club. The shopping center was turning over tenants quite rapidly. And then Higher Ground had their first incarnation in that space. And really, this was back when Alex Crothers and his partners were, really just getting started. And they just wanted any place, right, to be able to put on their shows.
He was the same age as you, right?
He might be a little younger than me, but we're pretty close. Yeah, we're pretty close. So, you know, if you think about, people ask me all the time, you know, you must be very proud of what you did down there, and, you know, of course, your brain always goes to the things that didn't work, right? And we spent a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out how to get Alex to be, and Higher Ground to be part of the development, because we felt having a destination for these, you know, shows and having a nightlife and having is just part of a healthy downtown, right? But the reality at the end of the day was, you know, no matter how you go about tearing something down and building something new, you've got this 12 months, 18 months, 24 months of brain damage that's happening, and it's just not practical to have someone do that. So it's for better or for worse, we funded, when we bought the shopping center, we funded a federal relocation for them. So they were able to go and buy the location they're in now and do their renovation, largely because we were required, since we were using federal money to do all of this, you have a requirement to relocate people fairly. And so we were at least able to get them significant resources to do that. But, you know, of course, I would have been much happier to use those resources to have them in town, you know. I've tried on 2 other occasions over the last 25 years to bring them back to Burlington, most recently, sorry, to Winooski, thank you.
He lives in Burlington.
I don't live in Burlington anymore, but I hear you. Let's not mix them up. That's a whole nother presentation. The River Rats versus Burlington presentation. But the idea most recently was to put them where Four Quarters is. So when Redstone originally bought that parcel, we bought it with my help to tear that down and build a facility of Higher Ground there. So they've always had this affinity for Winooski, and I've always been super grateful for it, even though we've never been able to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
Could you just clarify what you were selling, or what vision you were articulating to those who were going to be giving you loans, whether...
Yeah, sure.
Because
I don't think we...
the kind of master plan planning
Yeah, yep.
against the, selling the vision.
Yeah, no, for sure. I got distracted, which, as you have figured out by now, is easy for me to do. So I
ran him in from time to time.
No, absolutely, for sure. So we always had some board like this, even from the very beginning when we were trying to sell this. And the idea was, am I blocking you by being here? We really wanted to do a couple of things. Reestablish a pedestrian-oriented neighborhood, in this area. Mike always talks about, and he was right, how do we make this a pedestrian-friendly downtown again? And it had to start with not having 6 lanes of traffic in the middle of town and a slip lane. My thing that always made me laugh here is their improvement was to add this huge curve here at the top of the hill so people could come rocketing around the hill at like 40, 50 miles an hour, because the VTrans folks were concerned about how to move traffic, right? People are not their primary concern, or at least weren't in the 1980s. And so this was 6 lanes of traffic, and it was like, if we can't figure out how to move people back and forth across the street more efficiently, we're not going to be able to get there. And that's where we looked at so many different versions, some of which are pretty exciting, actually, before we landed at the roundabout, to try to say, in my mind, the idea was, if we can cross 2 lanes of traffic at a time, we're at least making this something that people, that if I were here with my kids, I'd be okay letting them do it, right? The original construction of that roundabout had actually the only traffic light left in downtown Winooski was there to stop people so people could cross the street. There were changes made to it after that I think that aren't my particular favorite thing that have happened, and I think have caused a lot of people to wonder why we did it in the first place. But the idea really was originally, we want to make this about pedestrians. How are we going to let people cross back and forth? And because this was a major state highway, it was also an avenue to access state and federal funding to pay for it. This was around the time when the kind of grants that are pretty common now for bike paths and pedestrian improvements were just coming along and getting started, and VTrans was starting to think of themselves not just as a highway improvement, but also trying to make all modes of transportation workable.
Our Main Street is part of Route 7, correct?
That's right. It's Route 2 and Route 7, and actually the end of Route 15. So, you know, when this is actually on a map, on VTrans's map, the beginning of Route 15. It starts right here at the intersection of Main and Allen Street. So we were able to access those federal funds, you know, for the construction of Rotary Park and for all of the things that went around with it because it was deemed to be part of the federal highway system.
But what about the density of the development?
Yeah. So in terms of, this is a picture of standing kind of here at the intersection of Main Street and what was really the entrance to this huge empty parking lot, right? And I always liked, this is the Champlain Mill, and the idea was to try to talk about looking down Winooski Falls Way and seeing this urban streetscape. Now imagine at the time, what you were looking at was this giant empty pavement parking lot, you know, and so the idea, you can go stand there today and it doesn't actually look very much different than this, which always kind of cracks me up. But this was the first sort of streetscape drawing that Truex did of this whole area, of us saying, look, if we can solve for, if we can reintroduce the riverfront as a public resource, and we can solve for having an urban parking solution, then we can talk about these types of areas along these street fronts and these sidewalks and these connected areas as being things developers are going to want to make investments in, a place where people want to live, you know. And we want to break those up into urban blocks that groups like Halkeen or VSAC or individual developers could take down. Because if you look at this whole build out, you see this $250 million monster, which actually has come to pass. That's roughly how much money got spent down there over the last 25 years. But no one developer from New York was going to come in and execute all of those things at once. So the way that we saw this coming together was to create these various blocks of land that we would be able to convey with all of the necessary permits for somebody to build. So all they would need to do is decide whether it was apartments or movie theaters or office buildings, whatever they felt the market would support, they would be able to do that without having to start over and go through a whole rigorous permit process. Those of you who didn't spend the last 30 years trying to get permits for things like I have may not fully appreciate how long it takes to get a permit to do things in Vermont. But I tell my clients even today, with benefit of my 30 years experience, that if you want to build even a house in some areas of Vermont, you better be ready for at least 4 to 5 years of, you know, various processes and court battles to get there, because the reality is it's quite easy for people to oppose, and you know, anyone in the neighborhood can do it. So you sort of have to start, and it causes a lot of investment to not happen in Vermont. And our goal was, can we take that piece of the puzzle out? Can we create a flexible permit that will allow somebody to come in, and as long as it fits inside of the box that we've determined and it's on the list of uses that we got permitted, people would be able to simply, literally come in, purchase the land, and build. And once we got that permit, we were able to then go out into the marketplace and visit with all these developers, including Pizzagalli and later Halkeen. And while everybody likes the river, you know, the reason that investment happened in Winooski and not in Burlington on the lakefront, you know, for example, was we had a permit to construct the thing that somebody would want to build, and they didn't, right? And to a developer, the certainty of knowing they can start their work once they make their investment is very important, you know, to whether they're going to be successful or not.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
They didn't need a second planning application?
No, so, I mean, this is actually, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I think it's the most interesting thing that we did, right, as part of the project. So I'm going to try to find the right drawing to show you here. Let's start with this one. So this is one of the actual drawings that was sent to Act 250 for approval. I won't bore you to death with all the details, but Act 250, from the time it started, always had a small provision for what were called master plans. You were allowed to go to them and say, I don't know exactly what I'm going to build yet, but I can say that it's going to fit inside of this box and within these uses, and I can measure whether my building is purple or it's red I can measure that 10 units of housing is going to generate this much traffic, it's going to generate this much air pollution, it's going to generate X amount of environmental impact, and I'm proposing to mitigate those impacts in the following way, right? And so we filed with them these areas. You can see here it says master plan development area. So we would identify these blocks that effectively, and said within this block we can have up to X amount of development, 800 housing units, 1 million square feet of development. It's going to be this tall and this wide, and therefore we can say with certainty, this is the view it's going to block because it's going to be of a certain height. This is the amount of traffic it's going to have because there's going to be so many parking spaces. We don't know exactly what it's going to be used for yet. And the Act 250 Commission, if you provide them with enough evidence, can sign off on all of those things in advance. In this case, what we did was develop a very elaborate, effectively, zoning code that we submitted with this development and said, look, Act 250, what we'd like you to do is approve these boxes of development and also approve that as long as you stay inside of this code that we've developed, for, this quality of brick and this amount of storefront and these number of uses, that this development can then go forward with your approval without being reviewed again. And today we would call that a form-based code. If people are interested in zoning and know this, 25 years later, this was something that, now has, not because we invented it, but it's become more common. Towns like Williston, for example, you can come to Williston in what they call downtown. And Winooski too, and bring in a plan for development, and if it fits in the box that's been approved, you effectively can move forward without fear that you're going to be denied or have to start over again. But then it was not something that had been used in this way, and we were the first project, even though Act 250 was 20-something years old by then, we were the first project to use this structure to get this approval. And I think it's the one unique thing that we did that really wasn't built on old plans, but was kind of a new twist on things to try to, make this, what I perceived at the time to be the biggest problem that we had, make that go away.
Joe.
Question there.
Yeah.
One of the things you touched on early on in the presentation was about the potential loss of VSAC from the Champlain Mill building.
Yep.
Yeah. The myth I had heard about that was that, I don't know if it was because the Champlain Mill was in the floodplain or because it was a federal agency, they couldn't be in that space anymore?
I think they were looking for a bigger space. Okay. And I'll give, George Cross was in the legislature at the time, and he was a force of getting them here, as was Governor Douglas at the time. Stay in a downtown as opposed to go out and build in a field. Yeah. So, yeah.
You're talking about VSAC.
VSAC.
Recording what these people are
Okay.
saying.
Okay. Yeah, that was a question about VSAC.
Vermont Student Assistance
Yeah,
no, it's true. So, when this opportunity arose, and the video does a better job of it than we have explaining it, there was sort of a confluence of bad news, right? The shopping center was closing, so these things were shutting down. VSAC had publicly announced they were leaving. That they're, at that time, they had several hundred employees, that they had outgrown the space that they were in. The then director of VSAC had his heart set on building a glass tower on Water Tower Hill at exit 16. They had gone as far as kind of picking a site and drawing up some things. I don't think it had anything to do with floodplains. It was just their desire that they had created the second largest student loan agency in the world, or in the country rather, and they had plans to get bigger, and they just weren't able to fulfill their desire here. And a big part of the less exciting part of what we did in the first couple of years was to say, you guys can't leave. You're hundreds of employees. You're here. If you take that same investment you've already committed to and move it back down to our project, it'll have a huge catalytic effect. And the mayor's correct. I mean, I don't think it was universally true at VSAC, but certainly leadership was committed to leaving. And maybe the most successful thing that happened among local leadership was the lobbying effort that they put together to keep them. you know.
I know we talked briefly about the Riverwalk, and I just wanted to touch on that for a second because, excuse me, the original plan for the Riverwalk was to start on Main Street and be cantilevered off the riverside of the mill, and then connect on the other side and go into where it is now. Unfortunately, there was an issue with the mill, and they couldn't drive the beams into it without disrupting some contamination. The mill way back in the 60s, I think, was a wire, not fabricating, but General Electric had manufacturing plants. Yeah, filament, and they used mercury to coat the wires. And so there was mercury actually in, was it between the 4th and 5th floor or someplace in there. And the engineers decided if they tried to drive piles into the mill to support the Riverwalk, it was going to dislodge the mercury. So we came up with an alternate plan of going around the front side of the mill the way it is now. The other thing that was interesting is early on, we had the plan for this area along the river. And the Agency of Natural Resources came and said, oh, you can't build there because it's pristine river frontage. And we said, really? So we got the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources to come, and we walked down there. And as we're walking along, you could see bricks and pieces of concrete and tar and all kinds of stuff in there from the former development of that area. When they tore it down, it got dumped along the river. And he looked at his people and said, this is pristine? And they said, well, I guess not. So we were able to put the Riverwalk that close to the river just because of that. The other thing was part of I don't know if this is Act 250 or not, but one of the things was the desire to keep the view of the river of Winooski Block and the Champlain Mill available to the vehicles going by. And you can see that the park leaves the Winooski Block open, and you can see the Champlain Mill as you come down too. And there are two lots down here. We call them the east and west pad sites. And the west pad site was proposed for a hotel. And I think that's still actually bubbling along. But anyway, one of the things, the location of it had to keep the view of the Champlain Mill for traffic coming southbound down Main Street. So those are a couple things that we had to work with. And the height of the buildings couldn't be higher than the block, I think it was, right?
Yeah, there was a number of different, as we act like this Act 250 permit just materialized, and I suppose in a way it did in the scheme of how long these things take to happen. But as we went through the process with the historic preservation folks at the state in particular.
What an appropriate place to be talking about.
Exactly, for sure. You could see, for example, this is the original filing from 1999, and it showed the potential for all of the buildings along the south side of East Allen Street to be removed so that these development area could address the street directly over time. And one of the things that happened during the comment period for the permit was the state office saying, look, we can get on board with the impacts of the new development here given everything that's happened, but we draw the line at authorizing the removal of any more buildings. And so they asked, and we agreed, to effectively take all of these buildings that are still lining the south side of East Allen Street out of the development area. And so the large apartment project, Keene's Crossing, that's now sitting in this block here that was originally intended to address the street directly, it has its sort of back door there with an alley, and these buildings remained. And so there was a number of accommodations like that happened to try to get from these early cartoons to what actually happened there. And if someone has an interest in a certain area or a certain piece of property they'd like to talk about, I'm happy to follow up with you after the meeting as well.
I can kind to imagine at the state level, they're looking at that and thinking, oh, you're going to mow down another street. That's what got us in this problem in the first place. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, there's always a bit of a, you know, was it successful to keep those properties there? You know, I've had people over the years ask, why did you leave those eyesores there? I've had people come to me and say, thank God you didn't take those down, you know, and I think that's a little bit of the story of redevelopment in downtowns in general that I've come to appreciate in the 30 years that I've worked on it since then, since all of this started, is that, you know, these things evolve, whether you invest in them or not. These things have a life of their own. You know, the shopping center comes, the tenant leaves for some other reason. You know, you say, I like it the way it is, but the one thing I know for sure is it's not going to stay the way it is. It's going to evolve. And it's perhaps in some ways going to evolve the wrong way, right? And so you have to just roll with the punches that show up. And, you know, was that the right answer for this area? It certainly was, in the sense that we wanted to make something happen. You know, is that the most attractive street frontage now? Has it been? I don't know. You know, I think there's always that tension between people wanting to restore an old building and people, you know, not being able to do it because the cost exceeds the market value, you know?
You did mention earlier in your talk about drawing the parallel between Winooski's urban renewal and Burlington's urban renewal. The thing that's interesting about Winooski is, though, Burlington didn't tear down half of Church Street, which is effectively what we did in Winooski on the east side of Main Street. It was really the main downtown corridor that got wiped out.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, I don't know how many people, I mean, this, you know, urban renewal projects became a, you know, sort of a pet thing of mine after this happened, because you feel like you want to understand them better. And, you know, if you want to break your heart, right, you can go back to the HUD archives and pull all of the, you know, all of the really remarkable downtown developments that were ripped out, you know, in the late 1950s and through the 60s. The pictures, I have one, I didn't think to bring it. The pictures of downtown Burlington, you know, in 68, 69, after they cleared 10 blocks of downtown Burlington, you know, they'll take your breath away. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that much of the center of a community being removed. You're right, they didn't go all the way to Main Street, but the scope of it, you know, was really incredible. And we, you know, our project here in Winooski was very, very modest, you know, based on, let's say, Philadelphia, you know, Pittsburgh, downtown Baltimore, places where they really ripped out huge amounts of area.
I know you didn't want to talk about the dome.
Yeah. I didn't say that.
Well,
I'll talk about anything.
Let's call Peter Clavel.
Yeah.
Would you consider another presentation in which you showed how the dome was supposed to link to the new development as well as the preserved development? Because if there's a part of the project in my mind that hasn't really worked successfully,
yeah,
it's the rotary and the garage side of that development, right? And the constant danger that any pedestrian crossing the street, even with pedestrian lights, faces in dealing with traffic there.
Right.
I don't want to make that the.
No. I think it's really important. You know, I think it's really important. I have learned, you know, my involvement in this was sort of my life from 1998 until 2004, 2005. 6 months after construction started, I departed, and Jerry for the city took over and was involved.
And just think, we saw the pictures of you early on with the hair.
Yeah.
You left, that's what you look like.
Yeah, oh, sorry, right, yeah, he can't, that's exactly right. But I think that it's always useful to look back on these things when they've happened, and you can measure success in any number of different ways. Were we successful in making that area easier to cross back and forth? You know, was it as pedestrian focused as we wanted it to be when we started? And I think, to me, today, the answer is no, right? I think that for better or for worse, a decision was made to get rid of the mid-block crossing of that thing. It was determined that that didn't work and that it needed to change. And what one has to do now with sort of old-fashioned pedestrian crossings and figure it out at the corners and jump from one island to the next, you know, I don't personally feel, I would have considered that to have been a failure myself back when we did this the first time. Does that mean I'm right? No, I mean, I understand why what was done was done. You know, the VTrans was very uncomfortable with what we did from the beginning. And, you know, after those of us who were fighting for it hard weren't there anymore, the voices of wanting to change it again continued, you know. And there's always this balance of trying to get 35,000 people, cars, through the city on the one hand and making it work for the people who live there on the other. You know, I don't think it's as successful as I had hoped it would be. And so, sure, we should talk about it. You know, how when someone else has this challenge, how could they do it better, you know?
I mean,
But-
Sky Bridge from the garage to the other side, to the west side of the rotary would have, especially if it was covered in some fashion.
There actually was,
Would be a
interesting.
really creative way to start to think about.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you say that because I had actually forgotten about the bridge until you just said it. But right. So in the question was relating to why didn't we have some kind of an aerial connection from one side of Main Street to the other? And in fact, when I first came here, before we proposed any of this specifically, there had been for a number of years a proposal to build you know, what I always call the Tower Bridge in London, you know, over Main Street from this corner near the Champlain Mill to the other side of the street. This idea that the way to tackle the traffic was to, you know, convey people up into the air over 6 lanes of traffic and then back down again safely. And my predecessor in this job had spent 3 or 4 cycles of federal funding trying to get money to do that and was ultimately, you know, not successful because he wasn't able to convince enough people that people would use it, you know. There are lots of examples of urban development where those kinds of conveyances where you got to go up. The problem is you have to effectively go up 3 flights of stairs to get up high enough to, you know, get over the top of whatever it is you're going to do and come back down. And most of the ones that have been built weren't successful, you know, because people don't feel safe. There's a safety issues around feeling like you're trapped when you're halfway across and there's no way to go. And so we did look at it, but that was one of the ideas that had been hammered into the ground that I inherited. And I ultimately elected, you know, that I didn't want to try to be the guy who was pursuing the 4th straight year of that. And so it was important to me to think about how do we get people to cross the street in a way that makes them, you know, want to engage. I wanted people in cars to see everybody crossing the street and say, hey, why are those people here? Where are they going? You know, I want to be part of this, right? But I don't know ultimately whether we were as successful in that as we would have wanted. You know, I had a vision of that center park being used in a very, a more active way than the city has been able to use it. And that's just, you know, the realities of dreaming something versus making it work, you know.
you also mentioned the dome, and my recollection, there was never any discussion about the dome and how it would fit in and all that stuff. That was Mark Teigen and Peter Clavel back in the, 70s or so, late 70s?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that was very helpful, if any of you knew John Anderson and sort of his remarkable, sort of drawing skills and things, was that when I came into this and went up in the City Hall attic, there was this unbelievable pile of, cartoons, we used to call them, wishful thinking drawings of downtown. When we tear this urban renewal area down, who's going to come in here and build here? And that was in that time period of the dome and the federal funding and Peter Clavel bringing so much. There was a time when Peter was successful in bringing more federal funding per capita into the city of Winooski than any other organized place in the country. I mean, in the model cities era, Before Peter started drinking his own Kool-Aid about socialism in Burlington, he was here as a guy who grew up on Hood Street, you know, bringing a ton of, and I love Peter, don't get me wrong, but his first thing, you know, his first work with here with Mark Tigan, a predecessor of mine, to bring federal funds into Winooski was really, really incredible. And they had, frankly, been so successful in like grabbing every source of funding they could, that all of a sudden they were trying to go to NASA and like the 3 remaining public agencies they hadn't gotten money from. And that's where the dome thing came from, right? It was like they were masterful at trying to figure out how do we need a survey done of this area, like what federal agency can we say we need help from to do it?
So
and
that does relate to the Green Mountain Power owning that parcel. Apparently they were going to circumvent that from the upper falls to the lower falls. They were going to circumvent the river and have a hydro project.
That's right.
It was going to dry out the riverbed. And so as another energy conserving alternative, the dome was thrown out.
So where Hydro 1 is now, where the hydro dam that was built, they label those sites by the number of places where you can show you can do it. So Hydro 1 is the first spot where you could do it from the outflow of the river from Lake Champlain. Hydro 2 was the Riffle Falls, you know, in front of the mill. So you're right, Green Mountain Power owned all of this property, including the floodway on this side of the thing, not because they were going to dry it out, but it was the opposite. Their plan, they had a plan at one point in the 50s to dam the river at the Riffle Falls and create effectively a big backwater there, or have the capacity to do that. And when Hydro 1 was permitted and built, you're not allowed to have the dams that close together. And so by the time I came around, this dam existed, and Green Mountain Power had bought this land with the intention, all this 100 acres, with the intention of being able to put a dam there, but in fact couldn't anymore. But they're a pretty large bureaucracy, and it took us the better part of 3 years to convince them that they didn't need to own it anymore. It wasn't like we could afford to pay them zillions of dollars for it, and so they wanted to keep it. And it was a rather large chunk of our challenge between 99 and 2002 to convince them that we needed to not only put the boardwalk there, but actually own it, so that we could have the development, you know, address the riverfront as it does, you know.
Any other questions?
Okay, one ways back.
Yeah.
It seems to me from what you're saying that VTrans basically was calling the shots about whether this was going to be a car-oriented place or a pedestrian-oriented place. And many cities avoided that by closing down the downtown to pedestrians or providing a circle of traffic around it. To me, coming to Vermont later in my life and seeing this, what I see is that Winooski is an off-ramp and an on-ramp to Burlington. And I appreciate what you guys have done. I think what was there was horrendous, and the result of that hideous urban planning. So what we see is light years beyond that. So thank you. But the problems still remain of it being an off and on ramp for traffic, primarily for the medical school, but also for the city of Burlington.
No,
As such, it's impossible to really enjoy the downtown if you're a resident here.
Yeah, well, so the question, for the benefit of the people who may watch this in the future, God help you all, was having to do with no matter what you do with downtown Winooski, it's ultimately because it's the only bridge, right? I mean, the reality here is that bridge is the only bridge between, right, there's only a handful of bridges, so it's going to be in effect an on-ramp or an off-ramp for people coming from Colchester in the north, people coming from Essex in the east to get into Burlington, that it's, you can't stop it from being a major conveyance, a highway. We never had in our minds the idea that we were going to somehow tell the 35,000 cars a day that were going through town with no intention of stopping here that they would go somewhere else. There's nowhere else for them to go, right? You did say that I gave the impression that VTrans was calling the shots. I mean, here, the way that I would look at it is VTrans made decisions with the city's involvement in the 1980s when this was all torn down the first time, to take advantage of the fact that it was torn down, to widen the road to 6 lanes, to put in these slip lanes, to prioritize traffic flow over pedestrian use. It was 99% traffic, 1% pedestrian. Those choices got made, because the urban renewal made this land available, right? There were buildings right up tight to the storefront, to the street before then. So once they were gone, V-Trans was like, hey, let's widen the road. And that decision process had already happened and effectively run its course by the time we started this project. So I wouldn't blame V-Trans for decisions. By the time we were looking at this in the 90s, that road had been widened for 15 years and had been part of my life, the part of the reason why I wasn't going down there, because it was perceived that this really was just a highway. Have we been ultimately successful in, finding a better balance? I think it's better. Clearly crossing 2 lanes is better than crossing 6. Having areas where, things throttle down to 1 or 2 lanes causes people to drive slower than they did in the old days. It's not, what anyone would call 100% pedestrian oriented. And I think that's always the challenge of here. There was no rerouting traffic because the bridge is where the bridge is. And so it has to, wherever you reroute it to, it has to come back to that spot,
Build another bridge.
Well, fair enough. Yeah.
You can kind of see from that what we used to in the 90s. I remember that curve.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, in a way, the beginning of the rotary that we have now. It's just
I mean, so the other theme I would take away from looking at this 30 years later is, I have the same thought when people say, "Gosh, you built this racetrack." I'm like, well, there was a racetrack there. It was 6 lanes wide. You just don't remember it because you weren't here. Is that a defense of continuing to have it? Well, no. I can tell you that the original plan for rerouting traffic wasn't a traffic circle at all, but rather making Main Street a one-way street that was 2 lanes and narrowing it all down to make it easier to cross, and actually rerouting the rest of traffic down here around Center Street off to the west, and effectively having a one-way street grid in this direction. And unfortunately, anyone who's driven that particular area knows that the grades of the roads are so substantial in those areas that the only way that would work after we studied it was to remove a bunch of these buildings in order to allow trucks that are allowed to go on a federal highway to do that. And so, but when we started, we were not trying to build a traffic circle. We were simply trying to say, how do we make this road crossable for pedestrians, and how do we make this more pleasant? The rotary went from the size it started at to the size it is because V-Trans said, well, we can get on board with doing this, but only if you can show me how a 100-foot-long truck can get around it safely, because we have federal highway standards we have to follow.
It is worth noting, again, the old pre-urban renewal downtown was not designed for automobiles. And, there was a building right on that corner.
That's right.
My dad remembers, he said, if you stopped at that light in the winter, he said a hill start from that corner to make a right-hand turn was extraordinarily difficult.
Right.
So that's why that big swoop kind of came into play.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the worst things about happened in urban renewal projects in general is that when you take an urban area like this and you remove the impediment to widening roads, all the highway engineers went nuts, So, I mean, if you go look anywhere where those things got torn down, what's the first thing that happened? The highway department came in Boston and built a 940 lane wide elevated highway right through the middle of, a neighborhood because, they have the land to do it, right? So.
And Burlington was going to do that with Battery Park.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was all designed to be a ring road, right? So I think that is, even if we remove all of our love for old buildings and old fabric and history from these things, the challenge of all these urban renewal sites was once you get rid of that physical impediment, all of a sudden, you have lots of people jockeying to use that land for lots of things that may not be in the local best interest,
Doug?
Just a comment. Why couldn't we follow Boston's example and put those roads underground?
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I lived in Boston when they were putting it underground. I don't know that I'd want to go through that again.
They got a wonderful park.
Oh, listen,
Wonderful urban park.
Absolutely.
It doesn't necessarily link the two areas together.
Yeah.
The way it was
No, I think it's a
designed.
spectacular, I mean, again, so Boston's a great example for me. You're talking about the area in the center of town where they took the elevated highway down and I mean, so if you go stand at the south end of Faneuil Hall today, I mean, and you imagine the downtown Boston that I remember when I lived there in the late 80s. I mean, it's incredible, right? This string of beautiful parks with buildings, and I mean, there's people there, year round at a time when it was just muggers and drug dealers living under the highway, not that long before. But it all becomes a game of what you're comparing to, right? I mean, it was a vital neighborhood for a bunch of Italian families and Irish families 20 years before that. And so when I compare the elevated highway or whatever got done in urban renewal to where we are, I say, wow, what a huge improvement. When I imagine what had to get torn down to put it there, maybe I feel differently about it. My parents had their first date at Bill's Diner, which is got torn down in urban renewal, right? There's this lovely picture that Dan did, right, of the one that blends in the old and the new, shot from here where you can sort of see the redevelopment of Winooski and the old part of Winooski together. And, anyone who's lived here for generations, has some fond memories of the shops and stores and things that got torn down. And one man's, urban blight is another man's, affordable place to live, right? And I'd like to think we've all gotten better at doing it over time, but it's incremental.
Any other questions? Yes.
Question. It's not directly related to this project, but
Yeah.
it is Winooski related. Farther north on Main Street, multi-story buildings have been built where lower buildings used to be, and I noticed they come out closer to the street, which makes either no sidewalk at all or a very narrow sidewalk. Was that part of the plan, or was that just done individually?
It wasn't part of this plan.
No, it was part of the plan. I think it was about 2015 or so, maybe a little bit later. The city passed form-based code for, they called the gateways, which is East Allen Street, Main Street, and Mounts Bay Avenue. And part of that was, Bill mentioned it earlier, form-based code. You have an envelope, and it put the houses, the idea was to get the buildings up close to the street, the sidewalk. Hopefully, the redevelopment of Main Street that took place over the last couple of years has made, now there's sidewalks on Main Street, and street trees and all that stuff. But that's what that comes from, is the city rewrote zoning for what they call the gateway districts, which again are East Allen Street, Main Street, and Mounts Bay Avenue.
And what makes them gateway?
Entrances to the city, main entrances. So
I served on the planning commission with Mike, and there was a lot of discussion that took place about this, and we actually took at one point a walking tour of the redevelopment neighborhood that Bill here worked on, and we were quite impressed with the setbacks that were built in here, and we're trying to replicate that through new construction in the gateways, but I don't know that we ever quite got to that point. But
I think as a person who works on the development side of the more than the urban planning side, one of the difficult things that happens is this relationship between investment in public infrastructure and new development, right? So I would generally kind of agree with you. There can be an unfortunate thing that happens. The city has a vision. That vision is zero lot line urban development here, so that parking is screened behind, so that it feels like a city. It feels more walkable. There's stuff happening, and if that's paired with an appropriate amount of investment in public parks and sidewalks and street trees and public parking and all those things, well, that can work, but no matter how well someone coordinates that investment of money with the zoning, somewhere along the line there's the awkward teenager stage, And that's what I would call all of the buildings that got built along that stretch before the investment in infrastructure happened. So when I look at it wearing my planning hat, I think, well, did the city do the right thing? They wanted to focus development in this area. They got a lot of people to bring a lot of housing opportunities into town. Those things are all good. They weren't able to get the public money to build the streets as fast as they wanted. And so, you know, in some ways, people are guessing what that's going to look like when they build their building right now. And there's going to be some, you know, frankly, awkward teenager things that are going to happen when the infrastructure plugs in later.
Well,
On the other hand,
some of the buildings I'm thinking of, though, there's no room for trees. There's probably room for a person to walk.
right.
So
And-
that
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to defend a specific building. You know, I'm saying that, like, on the other hand, when I look at these things, I ask myself, people own land, they have the right to develop it. They had the right to develop it in sort of weird ways before, you know. I mean, when I look at it, I have the benefit of knowing how ugly that development could have been. And I say, well, what's there in my mind is better than what was there before they changed the zoning. It's a shame that that investment couldn't have been paired in exactly the same way, you know. Here's a great example I'll give you. You know, the sidewalk in front of Winooski Block, right, has a grade change, has an awkward grade change in it, right, that wasn't supposed to be there. And that was because despite trying as hard as we could, you know, to have all of the engineering aligned perfectly and the investment and the timing aligned perfectly with how this works, there always seems to be that last 5% that doesn't quite get where you want it to go. And, you know, does that mean I shouldn't do it at all, right? I mean, I wrestle with that sometimes because, you know, you do the work I do, you want to get it right. You don't want to get it 90% right. I think those are the things that happen when your public investment doesn't quite line up with your private investment as well as you would like, you know. You know, I don't think that means the city should stop trying, you know.
And we are, the Planning Commission is now talking about landscaping, street trees, things like that, and making them, quite frankly, the drawings we had when form-based code went through,
yeah,
the buildings may not look exactly like we thought they were going to look like. Can I say that nicely? And I mean, I don't know. So we keep looking at that because as I told people when I got on the Planning Commission after I was left as mayor, the zoning ordinance is a living document. It can change, and it needs to change to keep up with the times and keep up with what's happening. So yeah, we are looking at things like that.
And I understand that from the state level, the state wants infill in populated areas.
Yep.
And those buildings, I felt, were a response to that. You have more people living in this space where fewer people lived. And that would then work to encourage public transportation. Because public transportation doesn't want to run lines where there aren't enough riders.
Yeah.
So it's part of a bigger picture.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, there is a goal, which I applaud, to get fewer cars get more cars off the road. Unfortunately, we don't have the infrastructure for that. Buses, bike lanes, those kind of things. So it's a great goal, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take some time to get there. So.
Also, Winooski, by getting greater density, could only get it without disturbing the single-family house residential districts by building higher along the core corridors.
Yeah,
That's been very effective, I think, in terms of budget for the town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has. I was on the formulation committee, oversight committee, when that happened. I was new in town. I didn't realize the vast majority of the historical buildings in town were in the corridors that we were doing.
Yeah.
And I didn't know enough about the town to recognize what was there. So I was a big proponent of the notion that Winooski needed to grow if it was going to live. Right? I mean, Winooski subtracted itself, seceded from Colchester. It's a little over 1 square mile. It's got over 7,000 people living there. And the only way it can grow in a way that will maximize revenue in tax returns to the government is to grow up. Literally.
I have no objection to that. I think that makes
no,
sense. It's just that the straight line is.
Now I'm on a committee, the Local Resources Advisory Board for the City Council, that in effect is the Historic Preservation Board. Right? So I started my time just after 2010, or beginning of 2011, and a couple of years later I was on this Gateways Committee. I'm ending it on the Historic Preservation Committee.
A step up. So you mentioned about a square mile. Sally always had a term for the city of Winooski. 1 square mile of fun and what was it? Come on, Sally. See, and I remembered your name today. We had a little joke when CCV was being built. We had the groundbreaking, and I was mayor at the time, and Sally was deputy mayor, I think, at the time. And I was introducing the council members, and I got to Sally, and I said, Sally, and I couldn't think of her last name. And it felt like a year went by, and I finally, Tipson. And so the next city council meeting, Kathy DeCaro, who was the city manager, made name tags and put them, so I sat across from her desk. She put them on the front of her desk and said, so you don't forget the names.
There's 1 square mile of fun.
1 square mile of fun, yeah.
It is kind of interesting because we went all the way back to urban renewal, and there are these eras, you know, like there's the mill era, the urban renewal era, the Renaissance era, and then we come into like the redevelopment era of the early 2000s, and now I think we're kind of in the form-based code era, and they all kind of dovetail into one another.
So back there, you have a question, do you?
Yeah, I was wondering what happened with that grocery store and how we can be walkable or a pedestrian-centered town if the only grocery store.
You talking about commodities? That was the one that was downtown?
This old, like, on one of those maps.
Oh, the old super value.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well,
Actual commodities are not affordable and waste, like,
right.
I'm thinking something that would be.
So the question is, we lost the grocery store at the beginning of this redevelopment. What do we do if we're trying to make it a walkable community? We don't have a grocery store. Basically, that was the question. So when this started, believe it or not, Clem Bisonette, who's here in spirit, did a lot of work. Actually, we all did a lot of work trying to figure out how we could get a grocery store into the downtown. And we approached Hannaford's, Shaw's, all the big stores. Nobody wanted to be in the downtown. They wanted to have a store where you could have parking in front, just like when you go to Shaw's or Hannaford, any place. They wanted to have parking in front. They didn't want to have it in a garage. They didn't want to have it on the street. They wanted plenty of parking in front of the store. We couldn't attract anyone here. The best we did was commodities came in.
Yeah. But I think it's an entirely valid criticism. You know, when you imagine what it took to get this financing approved. You know, I was going door to door in the city back in 2000, 2001, trying to get this done, and we're showing all these cartoons and things, and you know, what's here on these drawings? You know, 1,000 units of housing and office space. You know, jobs. And what would happen is, you know, families that I'd known forever would say, well, Billy, I might support this because, you know, I put some faith in you, but I already have a house and I already have a job. You know, what I want is a dry cleaner. I want a grocery store. I want shops and services. And we had to, you know, I had to explain, hey, look, if we don't bring the kind of people into our city who want to, you know, who want to live an urban existence like we used to have here, then you don't have enough people to support these stores and these uses. And unfortunately, we need more density to support them. We had those things,
and you all decided to get in your car and drive to Shaw's. You know, when I was a kid, this grocery store existed in downtown, and where the community center is on Mallett's Bay Avenue, there was another grocery store. There were two, you know, real grocery stores.
And when I was a kid, where Four Quarters was a Grand Union.
Right.
Yep.
And there were 15 what I would call now bodegas, you know, that existed around Winooski that were, you know, all closing shop, right? So,
Tom's,
you know, Chicks. I mean, so my you know, people when I went to college in the '90s and told people that I got on my bike and rode down the street and put my, you know, grocery bill on credit down the road and like came back and got a penny candy for free, people thought I was like, you know, 40 years in a time machine or something. Right, exactly. I mean, people said that you got to be kidding me. That was Winooski. You know, my grandfather didn't have a car. You know, until late in his life because he walked to work and, you know.
I think that's a lot of what people lamented post-urban renewal. We had a city that had a small town flavor, and that has all kind of been.
Yeah.
I think we've always been a city that has punched above its density weight, right? All the way back to Ira Allen playing speculator here. You know, we've always been a pretty high density. We might have a particular time period stuck in our heads that we liked better, but we always had more stuff in a small space than anyone around us, you know, and that's still true, you know. But I think it's an entirely valid criticism, this idea that it broke my heart when the store left, because any store, you know, you got to have some way to walk and get a jug of milk if you're going to have a walkable downtown.
And some of the things we heard was we don't have a grocery store, we don't have a hardware store, we don't have a dry cleaner, and it's like,
Nice big liquor store.
yeah, we do have a nice big liquor store.
The question is, can you do anything about this now? I mean, there's a change in supermarkets, you know, going to smaller.
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, I mean, who's we in this context, right? I mean, you know, if I were doing this again today, I would be doing the same thing we did back then, which was to say, we're not going to tell people what should go into this space. We're going to create this opportunity. We're going to go out and try to get people to come and do things that work and support the community. But ultimately, someone has to feel they're going to make 5 cents operating a store in order to make it work, you know. And we weren't able ultimately to be successful then. I think if you look around the country, what you're seeing is more and more support for locally owned, you know, ethnic grocery stores, and at least opportunities to be able to have certain communities that can, you know, that can service things on a very small scale, which may not be exactly everything for everyone, but they're better than being in a car. The reality in Vermont is those grocery stores that we had died because people were unwilling to shop in them. They decided that if they were going to drive a quarter mile to IGA, they might as well drive a half a mile to the bigger store. And, you know, that's still, unfortunately, for everyone except the people who live downtown, still the case.
So I see Joe standing up, which I think is the sign that to cut it off. So anyway, but we hope that it was informative, and as Billy said, if you want to come up, have any questions, we're happy to stick around and talk or whatnot.
And I will personally, again, extend my thanks to you, because I do remember this quite vividly, and I remember those shopping carts along the river, and it to me, it's undeniably an improvement, so thank you.
I failed to mention the shopping carts we saw when we walked with the Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources along the river.
Yeah. So another person I'd like to thank who's not here right now is, you know, Al Blondin spent a lot of time documenting all of the evolution of this, and he did this all for volunteer work through the Winooski Historical Society. And I think this is one of the valuable functions of having a historical society, is to document and talk about change.
And those are out of your
right, out of our museum in the Champlain Mill. Yep. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you learned a lot, and it keeps us asking these questions as we go forward, because it is an ongoing process, as Mike knows, and he's slugging it out on the Planning Commission. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.